Lesson 8.6, Video 1, the quadratic formula. As mentioned before, we solve a quadratic function by graphing. The solutions are called x-intercepts. If we solve a quadratic function by factoring, the solutions are called zeros. And if we solve a quadratic function by the quadratic formula, or completing the square, or rooting both sides, the solutions are called roots. So here we have at the end of our path the culmination of our efforts where we had tried to complete the square, and this is where it gets real interesting because somebody said, you know what, I know that completing the square works for trinomials that are factorable and for trinomials that are not factorable. And most trinomials are not factorable. So he got smart and said, you know, I'm being asked to complete the square all the time so I can do these trinomials. But if I took a quadratic equation, a quadratic function in standard form with a, b, and c, and I completed the square with letters, so I did a major algebraic process, and I completed the square with letters, what that person created was called the quadratic formula, which allows the reader to not have to complete the square. They can just plug the proper a, b, and c values into that formula and it will give you your solutions. But in order to do so, you have to remember that you have to have your equations in standard form and you have to make sure you know what a, b, and c are. So this is a real brief overview of the quadratic formula, but what it does is it allows us to do lots of calculations in a much shorter amount of time. But you have to be careful. This formula looks pretty straightforward, but if you're not careful with your calculator, you're going to have some trouble. And two places where this is very true, number one, it's right here, and the other is that negative. You have to be very careful with your signs and make sure you remember that you are squaring something. So for example, if I have -3 and I square it, I have a 9. Sometimes people put in their calculators, oh, -3 squared, and the calculator says -9. The parentheses matter, and with this formula, you are always using parentheses when you square something, so keep that in mind. And this ends Lesson 8.6, Video 1.